Joseph Franklin Rutherford, also known as Judge Rutherford, was the second president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He played a primary role in the organization and doctrinal development of Jehovah's Witnesses. Much of the ascetic lifestyle Jehovah's Witnesses are known for can be traced back to Rutherford. The totalitarian ideology, which Watchtower calls a theocracy, also finds its roots in Rutherford's teachings, as well as the strong misogyny of the organization. Of all the ideas that witnesses are recognized for, however, Rutherford must also be given credit for the bloodiest of them all: the slaughter of all non-Jehovah's Witnesses by God at Armageddon. How did a man baptized in 1906 rapidly rise to power to become the president of the Watchtower only 11 years later? To find out, we'll have to dive deep into the history of the Judge of all the earth. Joseph Franklin Rutherford was born on November 8, 1869, and raised in near poverty in a Baptist farm family in Missouri. By the age of 16, he became interested in law, much to the chagrin of his father, who only allowed Rutherford to go to college if he would pay a hired worker to take his place on the farm while he was gone. Rutherford took out a loan and worked as a court stenographer and door-to-door encyclopedia salesman. Rutherford was admitted to the Missouri bar in 1892 and eventually became a trial lawyer and prosecutor. At the height of his legal career, he became a special judge in the 8th Judicial Circuit Court of Missouri. A special judge is a substitute judge, though Rutherford is only documented as having presided over a single court case in this capacity. Despite his very limited experience as an actual judge, this appointment won him the name Judge Rutherford by the International Bible Students, the group out of which Jehovah's Witnesses branched off. In 1894, Rutherford was visited by two coal porters, the previous title of the modern-day pioneer, or person who spends a lot of time in the proselytizing work. He bought the first 3 volumes of Charles Taze Russell's Millennial Dawn series from the coal porters and was struck by Russell's sentiments towards religion, which mirrored his own. Rutherford viewed all religions as insincere, shallow, and hypocritical. He was baptized 12 years later, in 1906. Less than a year later, in 1907, Rutherford became legal counsel for the Watchtower Society at its Pittsburgh headquarters, a sign of the influence and forceful personality that would win him the Watchtower presidency a decade later. Around this same time, he also began to give public talks as a pilgrim representative of the society. As Russell's health deteriorated, Rutherford represented him on trips to Europe, and in April 1915 he was deputized to speak at a major debate with Baptist preacher J. H. Troy in Los Angeles before an audience of 12,000. Rutherford also wrote a pamphlet, A Great Battle in the Ecclesiastical Heavens, in defense of Russell, and served as chairman of the Bible Students Los Angeles Convention in September of 1916. Despite all of the positions and influence held by Rutherford, he was not Russell's first pick to be on the board that would run the Watchtower magazine after his death. In fact, Rutherford was only an alternate on a secondary list should a vacancy need to be filled. However, by 1916, Rutherford had become one of the 7 directors of the Watchtower Society, and when Russell died on October 31, 1916, Rutherford was one of a 3-man executive committee that ran the Pennsylvania Corporation until a new president was elected the following January. Starting with the December 15th issue of the Watchtower, despite Russell's will indicating otherwise, Rutherford also joined a 5-person editorial committee to run the magazine. Tensions at the Watchtower Society headquarters mounted as the day for election of the Society's officers approached. Electioneering and politics were rampant in headquarter halls. However, the two other men on the executive committee backed Rutherford for the Watchtower presidency. On January 6, 1917, Rutherford, at age 47, was elected president of the Watchtower Society, unopposed at the Pittsburgh Convention. His selection gave him full charge of the organization's worldwide affairs. It didn't take long for Rutherford's ambition to cause dissension in the ranks, however. Within 5 months, 4 of the 7 Watchtower directors decided they had erred in endorsing Rutherford's expanded powers, claiming he had become a power-hungry autocrat. An attempt was made to rescind the new bylaws that gave Rutherford his power, and despite much legal wrangling, the 4 opposing board members were ejected from their positions. Both the Watchtower and the deposed board members published pamphlets accusing each other of ambitious, reckless behavior, with the former directors also claiming Rutherford had required all headquarters workers to sign a petition supporting him and threatened dismissal for any who refused to sign. The controversy fractured the Bible student movement, and some congregations split into opposing groups loyal to either Rutherford or those he had expelled. By mid-1919, about 1 in 7 Bible students had chosen to leave rather than accept Rutherford's leadership. By 1931, thousands more would also leave due to Russell's barrage of organizational changes, restrictions, and controls, as well as his doctrinal alterations. In late 1916, work began on what would misleadingly be labeled as the posthumous 7th volume of Russell's Studies in the Scriptures, which was actually written by George H. Fisher and Clayton J. Woodworth and edited by Rutherford, all without the full board of directors and editorial committee's approval. It was released by Rutherford to headquarters staff on July 17, 1917, the day he announced the appointment of the 4 replacement directors. The volume contains several interpretations and viewpoints not espoused by Russell, including an urging of all Bible students to cast judgment upon Christendom and its clergy, the adoption of new dates for the fulfillment of particular prophecies, a claim that salvation is tied to membership within the Watchtower Society, as well as shunning and censuring any who reject the interpretations given in the volume or related articles in the Watchtower magazine. It was immediately denounced by Rutherford's opponents, but became a bestseller and was translated into 6 languages as well as being serialized in the Watchtower. Expecting God's kingdom to establish rule on earth and for the saints to be raised to heaven in 1918, Rutherford wrote in January of that year, "The Christian looks for the year to bring the full consummation of the church's hopes." Rutherford embarked on a vast advertising campaign to expose the unrighteousness of religions and their alliances with beastly governments, expanding on claims in the finished mystery that patriotism was a delusion and murder. The campaign attracted the attention of governments, and on February 12, 1918, the book was banned by the Canadian government for seditious and anti-war statements. About 2 weeks later, on February 27th, the Army Intelligence Bureau seized the Society's Los Angeles offices and confiscated its literature. Then U.S. Attorney General Thomas Watt Gregory condemned the finished mystery as one of the most dangerous examples of propaganda, a work written in extremely religious language and distributed in enormous numbers. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Rutherford and 7 other Watchtower directors, who were charged under the 1917 Espionage Act of attempting to cause insubordination, disloyalty, refusal of duty in the armed forces, and obstructing the recruitment and enlistment services of the U.S. while it was at war. On June 21st, 7 of them, including Rutherford, were sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Rutherford feared his opponents would gain control of the society in his absence, but on January 2, 1919, he learned he had been re-elected president at the Pittsburgh Convention the day before, further feeding his ego and convincing him that God wanted him in the position. In March 1919, the directors were released on bail after an appeals court ruled they had been wrongly convicted, and in May of 1920, the government announced that all charges had been dropped. Rutherford emerged from prison bitter against the world and the collusion he saw between the clergy and military that had secured his imprisonment. The doctrinal changes he would institute were a clear reflection of this aggressive new attitude. Soon after his release, he coined the term Satan's organization to refer to this supposed conspiracy, a term that is still in use among Jehovah's Witnesses today. Free from prison, Rutherford now went on a tear of reorganization. The Golden Age, later renamed Consolation and then Awake, began to be published in May 1919, despite it being decreed in Russell's will that the Society should publish no other periodicals. Within months, Bible students were organized to distribute it door to door. Rutherford expanded the Society's printing facilities, revived the colporteur work, and in 1920 introduced the requirement for weekly reports of Bible students' preaching activity. That's right, Rutherford is responsible for the time slip that's all too familiar to Jehovah's Witnesses. Rutherford regarded his massive restructuring and reorganization as a cleansing and sifting work. Then came the 8-day convention, which is probably the most famous among Jehovah's Witnesses, Advertise the King and Kingdom. It was in Cedar Point, Ohio in September of 1922. Rutherford stressed it was the duty of all Bible students to be publicity agents for the Lord, and especially important was peddling the Society's publications in the door-to-door ministry. Rutherford also began teaching at this convention that Christ's reign had begun in 1914 and not 1878 as Russell had taught. By 1928, Rutherford began teaching that his famous convention was a fulfillment of prophecy from the book of Daniel, chapter 12. In 1925, he gained full control over what doctrines would be taught in Watchtower Society publications, overruling the refusal by the 5-man editorial committee to publish his article, Birth of the Nation, which contained significant doctrinal changes. As was his way, Rutherford later claimed Satan had tried to prevent the publication of that article. In 1927, the Watchtower Society ceased printing of Russell's studies in the Scriptures. The editorial committee was dissolved in 1931, after which Rutherford wrote every leading article in the Watchtower until his death. The 1933 Watchtower Society yearbook observed that the demise of the editorial committee indicated that the Lord himself is running his organization. And indeed, Lord Rutherford was. Rutherford expanded his means of spreading the Watchtower message in 1924 with the start of 15-minute radio broadcasts, initially from WBBR, based on Staten Island, and eventually from a network of as many as 480 radio stations. But his attacks on the clergy resulted in both the NBC and BBC radio networks banning his broadcasts. In 1928, Rutherford began to abolish the system of electing elders by congregational voting, dismissing them as haughty and lazy, and finally asserting in 1932 that electing elders was unscriptural, though he himself had been elected as head of the Watchtower Society. He impressed on elders the need to obey the Society's regulations, instructions, and directions without complaint. This too was attributed by Rutherford as the fulfillment of prophecy from the book of Daniel, claiming that God's sanctuary, the Watchtower Society, was thereby cleansed. And indeed it was cleansed of dissension. During these years, Rutherford also urged Watchtower readers to view with contempt anyone who had openly rebelled against God's order or commandments, and also described elective elders of the 1930s who refused to submit to Watchtower Society administrative changes as despicable. With so many organizational and doctrinal changes, and with so many Bible students opposing him, at a 1931 Bible Student Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, Rutherford proposed a new name for the organization, Jehovah's Witnesses. He wanted to differentiate his religion from the proliferation of other groups that had broken away to continue following Russell's teachings. Bible students who opposed or abandoned Rutherford to form new groups were increasingly described as the evil servant class by the Watchtower, which said it was wrong to pray for those who were unfaithful. 4 years later, the term Kingdom Hall was introduced for the local meeting place of congregations. In 1937, the door-to-door preaching program was extended to formally include back calls on interested people, and witnesses were urged to start one-hour Bible studies in the homes of householders. In the late 1930s, Rutherford advocated the use of sound cars and portable phonographs with which talks by, of course, Rutherford himself were played to passers-by and householders. In 1938, he introduced the term theocracy to describe this new autocratic system of government with Rutherford at the head as Lord and Master. Zone servants, now known as circuit overseers, were appointed to supervise congregations. In a Watchtower article around this time, Rutherford declared the need for congregations to get in line with the changed structure. Rutherford's heavy-handed reorganization resulted in a mass exodus of Bible students during the 1920s and 1930s, with worldwide attendance of the memorial of Christ's death dropping dramatically and not reaching its 1925 numbers until 15 years later. Naturally, Rutherford dismissed the loss of the original Bible students as the Lord shaking out the unfaithful. From 1925, he developed the view of the Battle of Armageddon as a universal war waged by God, rather than Russell's belief that it was the decline of human society into social, political, and religious anarchy. From 1929, Rutherford taught that the vindication of God's name, which would ultimately occur when vast numbers of unbelievers were slaughtered at Armageddon, was the primary doctrine of Christianity, and more important than God's display of goodness, grace, or mercy toward humankind. In 1932, he published an interpretation of a passage in Ezekiel describing the attack on Jerusalem by Gog of Magog, in which he predicted an intensification of persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses that would culminate in God intervening on their behalf to begin the Battle of Armageddon, which would destroy all opposers of God's organization. Watchtower has continually capitalized on this persecution complex in the decades that have passed since Rutherford's death. According to author Tony Wills, Rutherford seemed to relish his descriptions of how completely the wicked would be destroyed at Armageddon, dwelling at great length on prophecies of destruction. Wills claims that towards the close of his ministry, Rutherford spent about half of each year's Watchtowers writing about Armageddon. In 1927, Christmas was declared to be of pagan origin, and the following year its celebration by Bible students was condemned as supporting Satan's organization. Mother's Day was condemned in 1931, with other holidays as well as birthdays officially renounced in the years that followed. Rutherford's desire for austerity was so great that in 1938 he directed singing at congregation meetings be stopped, though it was reinstated soon after his death. Russell's teaching that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built under God's direction was overturned in 1928, when Rutherford asserted that it had been built under the direction of Satan for the purpose of deceiving God's people in the last days. This announcement prompted further defections among long-time Bible students. In 1930, Rutherford published a systematic reinterpretation of the Book of Revelation. Many of the symbols recorded in the book were applied to events following 1918, specifically to Watchtower conventions held in the years 1922 through 1928. These reinterpretations reflected both a wholesale rejection of his own earlier views as well as the interpretations of Pastor Russell. At a Washington, D.C. convention in 1935, Rutherford rejected Russell's teaching that the Great Company of Revelation chapter 7 was a secondary spiritual class that would be resurrected to heaven apart from the 144,000 elect. Instead, Rutherford argued that the great multitude were the sheep of Matthew 25 and the Jonadabs of 2 Kings chapter 10, and that they all picture the people who could potentially survive Armageddon and receive everlasting human life on earth if they became Jehovah's Witnesses before it began. It was Rutherford who is responsible for the second-class citizenry of the so-called Paradise Earth. In 1935, Rutherford objected to U.S. state laws requiring school students to salute the flag as a means of instilling patriotism. In the 1936 yearbook, he declared that baptized Jehovah's Witnesses who did salute the flag were breaking their covenant with God and were thus guilty of death. Numerous court cases ensued as children were ejected from schools across the country for refusing to salute. In what may be the only bright point of Rutherford's dictatorial control of the Watchtower, a U.S. law magazine, the American Bar Association's Bill of Rights Review, noted how Jehovah's Witnesses had helped shape the course of constitutional law, saying, "Through almost constant litigation, this organization has made possible an ever-increasing list of precedents concerning the application of the 14th Amendment to freedom of speech and religion." In 1936, Rutherford rejected the belief that Jesus had been executed on a Roman cross, in favor of an upright stake or tree. Many did not accept Rutherford as Watchtower's rightful second leader, and Rutherford took insult with brothers having beards in imitation of Russell. According to the book 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, the judge did not want anything at all to remain which might remind him of Russell, not even the cultivation of a beard. So, sitting at the table for dinner one night within my earshot, the director of the German branch asked the judge for one more large rotary press. The judge said nothing for a while, merely ate. So, suddenly he looked up, his eyes pinned severely on the director's huge beard, and said, "I will buy you the press if you take that thing off," pointing to the beard. To this day, beards are still frowned upon by Jehovah's Witnesses. Rutherford's books and magazine articles reveal his strong views on the proper place of women in the church and society. In a 1931 book, he linked the post-1919 rise of women's movements that encouraged equality of the sexes with satanic influence, and claimed the custom of men tipping their hats to women or standing when a woman approached was a scheme of the devil to turn men from God, and indicated an effeminate streak in men who practiced the custom. Mother's Day was similarly described as part of a plan to turn people away from God. In 1938, he urged adherents to delay marriage and childbearing until after Armageddon, which author Tony Wills claimed prompted a strong community bias among witnesses against marriage. Those who did marry, says Wills, were considered to be weak in faith. At a 1941 convention in Missouri, Rutherford quoted Rudyard Kipling's description of women as a rag and a bone and a hank of hair. Despite his desire for Jehovah's Witnesses to live an ascetic lifestyle, Rutherford did no such thing. In 1918, Watchtower Publications began predicting, under the direction of Rutherford, that Old Testament patriarchs, or princes, would be resurrected back to earthly life in 1925. It was taught that these princes would become Earth's new leaders, and that their resurrection would be a prelude to the inauguration of a new earthly society and the abolition of death. These princes would use Jerusalem as their capital, with some of the princes being located in other principal parts of the earth. Despite the failure of this prediction, Rutherford continued to preach their imminent return. Rutherford had reportedly lost the use of one lung from pneumonia suffered during his imprisonment in 1918 and 1919. Finding New York's winter weather impossible, Rutherford was encouraged by a doctor to spend as much time as possible in a more favorable climate. Rutherford began spending his winters in San Diego, California, and in time a direct contribution was made for the purpose of constructing a house in San Diego for Rutherford's use. Rutherford named the property Beth Sarim and dedicated it for the use of the expected Old Testament princes, who were now expected to be headquartered in San Diego instead of Jerusalem. The deed for Beth Sarim, written by Rutherford, said that the property was to be held perpetually in trust for the Old Testament princes and was to be surrendered to them once they arrived. It was located in the Kensington Heights section of San Diego, over an area of about 100 acres, landscaped with olive, date, and palm trees so that the princes would feel at home. The 5,100 square feet residence is a 10-bedroom Spanish mansion with an adjacent 2-car garage. Rutherford moved into Beth Sarim in early 1930, while so many others were suffering great financial hardship due to the Great Depression, and served as caretaker of the property awaiting the resurrection of the princes. Newspapers of the time reported on Rutherford's lavish lifestyle, which included a 16-cylinder Fisher Fleetwood Cadillac coupe. The residence was cited by Olin R. Moyle, former legal counsel for Jehovah's Witnesses, in a letter to Rutherford in 1939, as one of the examples of the difference between the accommodations furnished to you and your personal attendants compared with those furnished to some of your brethren. In July 1939, Moyle also accused Rutherford of unkind treatment of the staff, outbursts of anger, discrimination, and vulgar language, and claimed his drinking habits were notorious, while also condemning his allowing the glorification of alcohol at Bethel. Moyle went so far as to cite unnamed former Bethel workers who told of occasional difficulties in getting Rutherford to the podium to give public talks due to inebriation. In a public letter to Rutherford in 1937, Walter F. Salter, the Society's former branch manager in Canada, claimed that Rutherford had exclusive use of luxurious and expensive residences in Brooklyn, Staten Island, Germany, and San Diego, as well as 2 Cadillacs, and alleged that on more than one occasion he had purchased for Rutherford cases of whiskey, brandy, beer, and other liquors. Unlike Russell, who believed the natural Jews would be restored to Palestine and return to God's favor, Rutherford denied there was a role for Jews in God's kingdom arrangement, and by 1933 he had reversed Russell's earlier teaching, claiming that prominent Jewish business leaders were arrogant, self-important, and extremely selfish, and would gain no favored standing with God. In this, Rutherford initially believed he had found a friend in Adolf Hitler. During the time of Rutherford, witnesses became known as a religion of hate, due to the Watchtower's tirade of insults against other churches and governments. The Catholic Church came under the greatest condemnation and brought this to the attention of the Nazi government, petitioning against the Watchtower Society. In 1933, the Nazi government banned the Watchtower's German operations. In an effort to overturn the ban, Rutherford sent a letter and a declaration to Hitler, in which he praises Hitler for his anti-Anglo-American campaign and his stance against the Jews. The English translation of the letter says, in part, "The Brooklyn headquarters of the Watchtower Society is pro-German in an exemplary way, and has been so for many years. For that reason, in 1918, the president of the society and 7 members of the board of directors were sentenced to 80 years in prison because the president refused to use 2 of the magazines published in America under his direction for war propaganda against Germany. These 2 magazines, the Watchtower and Bible Student, were the only magazines in America which refused to engage in anti-German propaganda, and for that reason were prohibited and suppressed in America during the war. In the very same manner, in course of the recent months, the board of directors of our society not only refused to engage in propaganda against Germany, but has even taken a position against it. The enclosed declaration underlines this fact and emphasizes that the people leading in such propaganda, Jewish businessmen and Catholics, also are the most rigorous persecutors of the work of our society and its board of directors. This and other statements of the Declaration are meant to repudiate the slanderous accusation that Bible researchers are supported by the Jews. The conference of 5,000 delegates also noted, as is expressed in the Declaration, that the Bible researchers of Germany are fighting for the very same high ethical goals and ideals which also the national government of the German Reich proclaimed, respecting the relationship of humans to God, namely, honesty of the created beings toward its creator. The conference came to the conclusion that there are no contradictions when it comes to the relationship between the Bible researchers of Germany to the national government of the German Reich. To the contrary, referring to the purely religious and unpolitical goals and efforts of the Bible researchers, it can be said that these are in full agreement with the identical goals of the national government of the German Reich. We are looking forward to your kind approval, which we hope to receive soon and want to assure our highest respect to you. Yours faithfully, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. When Rutherford's letter and declaration failed to appease Hitler into lifting the ban, Rutherford did a 180 and began to antagonize Hitler. On October 7, 1934, the speaker announced that congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide were meeting today in order to send cablegrams to Hitler, all at the same time, asking him to refrain from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. After praying to Jehovah, each group sent the following cablegram. Hitler Government, Berlin, Germany. Your ill treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses shocks all good people of earth and dishonors God's name. Refrain from further persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses, otherwise God will destroy you and your national party. Rutherford also sent a second letter to Hitler, this time threatening Hitler with punishment from God if the ban was not lifted. You may successfully resist any and all men, but you cannot successfully resist Jehovah God. I demand that you give order to all officials and servants of your government that Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany be permitted to peaceably assemble and without hindrance worship God. If by the 24th day of March 1934 there is no response to this earnest demand and nothing done by your government to grant the relief of the aforesaid Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany, then God's people in other countries will begin the publication throughout the nations of the earth of the facts concerning Germany's wrongful treatment of Christian people there. And having delivered the testimony, we will submit our case and leave it to Jehovah God by and through Christ Jesus to administer the punishment of the guilty ones in his own good way. Permit me to remind you that Jehovah warns that no one shall oppress his anointed. According to jwfacts.com, this later aggression of Rutherford towards Hitler no doubt exacerbated the strong stance Hitler took against Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would have suffered less had Rutherford acted more reasonably and with concern for the safety of German followers. The result was that Jehovah's Witnesses suffered unspeakable atrocities in Nazi concentration camps, with an estimated 1,200 dying. Many individuals displayed tremendous courage and conviction, and it is tragic that this unnecessary suffering was a result of the words and actions of their leader, Judge Rutherford. Rutherford underwent several medical treatments for colon cancer starting at age 70. In 1941, doctors gave him less than 6 months to live. Rutherford died at Beth Sarum on January 8, 1942, at the age of 72. Rutherford's burial was delayed for 5 months due to legal proceedings arising from his desire to be buried at Beth Sarum. But Beth Sarum was not a legally zoned cemetery. Witnesses collected more than 14,000 signatures for a petition supporting his burial at Beth Sarum, but the request was denied. The Pages of Consolation condemned San Diego County officials for their refusal to grant a permit for Rutherford's burial at the property, stating it was not the fate of the bones which they decided, but their own destiny. Nor is their blood on anyone else's head, because they were told 3 times that to fight against God, or to tamper with his servants' bones even, would bring upon them the condemnation of the Lord. So their responsibility is fixed, and they followed the course of Satan. Rutherford may have died, but his legacy of vitriolic application of all opposition to Satan the devil and his bloodlust for their destruction was being carried on by his followers. As has been clearly demonstrated, the great majority of major doctrines Jehovah's Witnesses are known for were established not by Charles Taze Russell, which Jehovah's Witnesses claim as their founder, but by Joseph Franklin Rutherford. Often accused of being a power-hungry autocrat that accepted no dissension or questioning of his authority, as well as being labeled a drunkard who lived in luxury while his followers suffered during the Great Depression, this is the man from which the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses was truly born. The rejection of all holiday celebrations, the fixation on the slaughter of billions at Armageddon, the misogynistic underpinnings of its doctrines, and the belief in a second-class citizenry that will live on earth rather than go to heaven, all of these current Watchtower doctrines can be traced back to the man who appears to have thought himself to be the judge of all the earth.